the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592 to 1598. Although the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592 to 1598 is a very remarkable and historical event in Korea, it is just called Bunroku no Eki, whose meaning is very reduced to the War of the Bunroku era in Japan. Japan just glorifies it and teaches the Japanese that Toyotomi, who unified Japan, had a great ambition and entered to Korea, but does not teach them in detail about the invasion war and its devastation. Then why doesn't Japan teach the Japanese exactly about the world's largest war in the 16th century that invaded Korea with its own great forces? 1. A virtually failed war in which most of the troops mobilized were unallied. During this 7 years invasion, Japan invaded Korea with a total of more than 280,000 regular troops. But the number of troops who returned to Japan safely to the end was about 80,000. Therefore, it was a completely failed war that lost more than 70% of the forces mobilized for the invasion of Korea. It was the first time in Japanese history that Japan's regular army made a foreign expedition. But most of the troops mobilized were destroyed by the counterattack of Korea, so it could not be called a victorious war. Japan, that had an ambition to occupy not only Korea and China but also India, must have an uncomfortable truth: that it did not want to reveal its dark history of losing most of its troops before stepping on the continent. 2. A one-sided defeat in naval warfare as a maritime nation. At that time, the Korean government thought that Japan, an island country, would have a stronger navy than the army, so it would be advantageous to bring the Japanese troops to land to compete. And Japan also thought their navy was stronger than Koreans. It means both countries thought Japan was stronger in the naval battle. In other words, Japan believed their navy must win. At the beginning of the war in 1592, General One's Korean Navy in Southeast Korea, where Japan invaded first, fled without fighting, and the Japanese army landed in Korea without any resistance. But since then, General Yu Sun-sin's powerful navy force in southwest of Korea has defeated in succession and blocked Japan's military supply plan through the West Sea of Korea. As a result, it turned the tide of the war, and the Japanese could not occupy more Korean territory. Afterwards, the Japanese Navy won a great victory over General One's Korean Navy, but the joy of victory was brief. Japan lost control of the Korean Sea by Admiral Yu Sun-shin, who returned to the command of the Korean Navy. During most of the war, when the Korean Navy appeared, the Japanese Navy abandoned their ships and stranded in their land main camp, showing its naval power that was unilaterally pushed back by Korean Navy. About 300 years later, in 1894, Japan annihilated the Northern Ocean Fleet of China, which was twice as numerous and armed with the latest European warships. In 1905, Japan destroyed the powerful Baltic Fleet of Russia and took control of the East Asian seas with a powerful naval force. After that, Japan advanced to the Pacific Ocean and became a country that fought against the United States. The fact that Japan was defeated unilaterally for 7 years in the naval battle against Korea during this invasion, which was just 300 years ago, was a shameful and reprehensible history for Japan. 3. A cover-up of war crimes. Taking lessons from the failure at the beginning of the invasion, the Japanese military took a devastation strategy that did not discriminate between Korean soldiers and civilians from the final portion of the invasion. In particular, Toyotomi found the cause of unfavorable war situation was the failure of Korean southwest area occupation. So, he ordered his army to invade this area and slaughter all people. In the end, the Japanese army carried out barbaric killings, kidnappings, arson, and looting, along with a massive invasion in southwest of Korea. That was the mainstay of Korea at the beginning of the war, was almost devastated. Japanese army attacked Jinju Castle in Korea and slaughtered all people, around 60,000 including civilians. and they killed again all people around 40,000 who fought in Namwon Castle and hunted for human in southwest of Korea. In Jinwanghyun, that was belonged to this area, its administrative district was disappeared, as all people were killed. There are 10,040 nose certificates cut from in Jinwan and Yanguang of this area. And there are 436 memorial gates for virtuous women who chose to die rather than be insulted by the Japanese enemy. Countless Korean civilians taken to Japan showed the devastation at the time. According to a book named Ganyanguk that Gang Hang, who was a Korean scholar, wrote at the time, Toyotomi ordered his army to verify they killed Koreans by sending Koreans' noses that were cut off, and then allowed to capture Koreans alive to sell as slaves to foreign country, and one soldier was ordered to cut off 3 noses of Korean. Accordingly, in order to capture Koreans alive and sell them as slaves, the Japanese army had to kill people first, and cut their noses to fill the quota. Therefore they killed not only Korean army but also civilians. It was recorded that there were so many people who had no nose after this war in Korea at the time, because Japanese army did not hesitate to cut their noses to living people, even newborns and their mothers. This poem was written at that time by Lim Kwan, a Korean officer, in his book named Subjang Yugo, A Man Without a Nose. A man without a nose, whose son, he's sitting alone at the foot of the mountain, covering his face and weeping. The enemy's sharp sword swings the wind. 1, 2, 100, and 1,000 people's nose were cut. All these cut-off Koreans' noses were sent to Japan as proof of their contribution in warfare. At least 50,000 noses of Korean were buried in the tomb of Kyoto, Japan, of which 20,000 were taken in southwest area of Korea. At the time, Katsushige Nagashima, a Japanese military commander, sent 3,369 noses of Koreans to Toyotomi. The certificate still remains. I well received 1,551 noses on September 13, 1597. I well received 3,369 noses. I well received 3,000 noses. This is the appreciation letter for noses that Toyotomi sent to his subordinate. On August 16, 1597, I well received the 269 noses that you sent after taking Namwon Castle of Korea. In addition to Kyoto, the tombs are also located in Vice, Tsuyama, and Kengoshima in Japan, where at least 100,000 noses of Koreans are buried in tombs throughout Japan. However, Japan has named Ear Tomb, which looks less brutal than the name of a nose tomb, to hide the crimes against humanity committed by their ancestors. Its very unusual appearance that a heavy stone statue is on the tumulus and suppress it, perhaps because Toyotomi was afraid the souls who died after cutting their noses may wander around Japan. The reason for this terrible tomb was to use it as a tool to show off Toyotomi's power to domestic and foreign political forces during the Toyotomi period. In connection with Toyotomi's reconstruction project in modern times, Toyotomi's shrine and the nose tomb after winning the Chinese-Japanese War in 1894 were extensively renovated, and the theory of the conquest of Korea was put forward, and colonized Korea in the name of realizing Toyotomi's unfulfilled feats. The nose tomb was used as a relic to inspire the Japanese people with the idea of foreign invasion. The reason that they made the nose tomb had nothing to do with the philanthropic spirit or humanitarianism that soothed the souls of the fallen soldiers of the other country. The Japanese also took numerous Koreans to Japan, enslaved them and sold them to Portuguese merchants. And the model of Rubens' painting in 1617, Men in Korean Costume, is a Korean who was sold to Europe at the time, and children and women were no exception. It is estimated that more than 100,000 Korean were taken to Japan. Jang Hee-duk, who was taken in September 1597 and returned to Korea in July 1599, disclosed in public appeals that there were 30,000 to 40,000 men and twice the number of elderly and women taken to Japan. And Korean women suffered even more because Japan legally allowed their troops have local wives and concubines during the invasion to encourage their soldiers. So, when the Japanese troops entered villages, combed through to find women firstly, take them away and live together, regardless of age. The physical damage was also enormous. The arson and looting of Japanese troops destroyed various cultural assets, treasures, historical sites, private collection books, land registers, and family registers in each government office. In addition, Toyotomi organized 6 special forces separately from the combat forces from the beginning of the invasion for systematic looting. The Crafts Corps kidnapped various craftsmen, ceramics, woodworking, potters, and the Prisoners Corps kidnapped Oriental medical doctors, young men and women. The Metal Corps were responsible for the plunder of Korea's weapons, metal arts, and metal types, while the Treasure Corps was responsible for the capturing of gold, silver, and rare items, while the Livestock Corps captured livestock. Even Korea's magpies, pheasants, ponies, countless tiger skins, pulse on camellia, plum trees, pine trees, ginseng, 5-leaf trees, ginkgo trees, take anything that is not in Japan. Meanwhile, the aftermath of this invasion was very serious to Korea. The population of Korea decreased by 2.15 million, from 13 million to 10.85 million in 1598. And farmland was decreased by 80%, so the people of Korea were in the grip of a famine after the invasion. Not only the terrible war crimes that Japan committed in World War II, but also they already committed terrible war crimes against Koreans in this invasion 300 years ago from the World War II. Japan wants to avoid the stigma of being an anti-humanitarian nation by concealing this fact. 4. Camouflage advanced technologies such as ceramics as their own. During this 7 years of the Japanese invasion of Korea, it was a cultural growth opportunity for Japan through looting famous scholars such as Korea's type, paintings, books, and taking great printing workers as prisoners and using them to develop Neo-Confucianism and printing techniques. In particular, Japan coveted the pottery techniques of Korea, so the Imperial Decree No. 1 of Toyotomi, who caused this invasion, was to kidnap Korean potters. In other words, Japan forcibly took away Korea's cutting-edge technology through the kidnapping of Korean potters who were managed by Japanese lords very secretively and importantly. Yi Sampyeong, who was taken to Arita, Saga Prefecture, Japan, and Sim Dang-bil, who was taken to Nasirogawa, Kagoshima, Japan, became the mastermind developed critically the Japanese ceramics industry. In particular, Yi Sampyeong, the originator of Arita pottery, became a ceramic god and Dojo Shrine was built in Arita. Eventually, Japan that had no ceramic production technology grew into a ceramic powerhouse through this invasion. Japan exported large quantities of pottery to Europe from around 1650, and Europe marveled at Japan's ceramic technology. Japan's enormous wealth accumulated through ceramics trade was assessed to be the basis of the Meiji Restoration, which led to Japan's modernization in 1868. It means the ceramics had a profound effect on Japan. In other words, the pottery technology that was stolen from Korea became a stepping stone for Japan to become a powerful nation in East Asia at the end of the 19th century. However, Japan never says that its ceramic technology has been transferred from Korea. For example, the Kyushu Ceramic Museum shows the history of Japanese ceramics in Saga Prefecture, Fukuoka, where Japanese ceramics originated. The exhibition materials here just start its chronicle from 1602 and do not indicate the fact that the Korean potter came to Japan during the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1592 to 1598, or that pottery was transferred from Korea to Japan. It can also be seen that museums in other regions deliberately omitted the records of Korea, are hiding the fact that Japan stole advanced technology from Korea through the invasion, distorting history and hiding the truth as if it were their own technology. 5. The denial of the existence of traitors in Japanese troops. There were many Japanese troops who surrendered spontaneously to Korea during this invasion. Such Sayaga, who was granted the name Kim Chung-sun by King of Korea, and Jinsa, who fought together in Korean Navy, are well known, and according to the record in the annals of the Korea dynasty in May 15, 97, its number of these kind of Japanese troops already reached 10,000. They were disappointed with hunger and the harsh treatment of Japanese generals, and finally defected to Korea. And they did not only defect to Korea but also made a significant contribution to Korea as intelligence soldiers, infiltrators, and combat soldiers against Japanese troops. For Japan, if it recognizes the existence of them, who betrayed their country in this invasion and were so many, it can make huge chaos to Japanese people who has proudly been taught the spirit of sacrificing one's life for their country like the kamikaze of World War II. And this mass traitors can cause the Japanese people doubt the legitimacy of this invasion. Therefore, the Japanese government has never acknowledged the existence of these traitors. In fact, the Japanese historical community commented on the record of Sayaga, the records written in antique books are absurd, and it is not correct that a traitor like Sayaga is our compatriot. There is no solid data on Sayaga and it is a fictional character. However, no matter how Japan denies it, the contents of these spontaneous surrenders can be cross-examined as the specific facts exist in various historical records of Korea. In particular, visits and exploration of the old house in Daegu, Korea, where Sayaga lived, have been increasing, especially in the Japanese private sector. They are Japanese tourists visiting here. Although the Japanese government does not officially acknowledge the existence of these spontaneous surrenders during this invasion, Japanese people recognize the truth and the existence of them gradually through various materials and evidence. 6. The invasion responsibility to Japan that unified strong Korea in the future can bring. It is a fear of Japan that unified strong Korea in the future can hold Japan responsible for this disastrous invasion and demand astronomical compensation for violated land and numerous people of Korea. Would it be too far-fetched to bring back what happened 400 years ago and hold it accountable now? Kenso, who was in charge of diplomatic affairs with Korea as a close aide to Toyotomi during this invasion, told Kim Sung-il of Korea, "In the past, Korea and China soldiers hit Japan. For this reason, we want to pay back our grudges to Korea, so it is natural that Japan invades Korea." In other words, Japan said that it would retaliate against Korea because the allied forces of Korea and China attacked Japan, even though it happened 300 years ago from that time and was failed due to big typhoon. After such a massive invasion by Japan, Korea suffered tremendous damage from it, which was difficult to recover even for several hundred years. Korea was revenged by Japan for what happened 300 years ago. If in the future, for any reason, the relationship between Korea and Japan deteriorates to an extreme level, wouldn't Korea be able to demand responsibility for the Japanese invasion of Korea 400 years ago, as Japan did? What Japan does not want the most is the emergence of a powerful unified Korea, but if this powerful Korea that has the strong military powers pressures Japan, it can be a great threat to Japan, so Japan wants to keep this invasion in history quietly. After this invasion, the Toyotomi regime collapsed, and a new regime named Tokugawa was established. Korea received official apology documents from Japan and restored diplomatic relations with Japan in 1607. That was 9 years after the end of the invasion. However, this was also done in a perfunctory manner under the Tokugawa regime's threat to reinvade if Korea refuses to do so, and there was no proper apology and compensation for the damage caused by the invasion. and the 67,000 pieces of Korea treasures and cultural assets that Japan has taken are still held by Japan, and there is no promise to return to its original owner, Korea. North Korea also criticizes Japan for it was an unacceptable national crime that slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Koreans and looted and destroyed numerous cultural assets. Japan may be uncomfortable and wary of Korea that may emerge in the future, ask for a proper apology and compensation for the pain and damage suffered by this invasion. You may wonder if it's really possible because of the past long ago, but it is history that repeats the history you've forgotten, and it is history. What you've never said becomes a reality. I hope that someday, in the relationship between countries determined by the harsh logic of power, the powerful Korea will receive due compensation and a genuine apology from Japan. I recall the Admiral Yi Sun-shin left a magnificent order to his subordinates in the last battle named Noryang during the Japanese invasion of Korea in 1590 to 1598. Get rid of even one more enemy, so do not let their descendants despise our descendants.